Long before PlayStation became a familiar object in living rooms, games were already quietly shaping how people spent their evenings. Televisions were often the center of the room, not because they were exciting, but because they were shared. Families gathered around screens without much expectation, sometimes just to watch, sometimes simply to sit together. Early games were simple, limited, and slow, but they introduced an important idea: that a small box connected to a screen could become a place to escape, a place where time passed differently. Even then, games were not really about winning. They were about presence, sitting still, focusing on something gentle and repetitive, letting the outside world fade for a moment. The brain quickly learned to enjoy this feeling: a controlled space, a predictable environment. This quiet relationship between humans, screens, and play existed long before PlayStation ever had a name. When the first PlayStation entered people's homes, it did so in a way that felt unusually calm for a piece of technology, as if it understood that it was stepping into spaces already filled with habits, memories, and quiet routines. It did not shine with bright lights or attempt to announce its presence loudly, but instead rested quietly beneath televisions, allowing itself to become part of the room rather than the center of attention. This subtle design choice shaped how people related to it, because objects that do not constantly demand attention are easier for the brain to accept and trust over time. Turning on the PlayStation never felt like starting a machine that required immediate focus or effort, but more like opening a familiar door and pausing briefly before entering another space. There was a small moment of stillness after pressing the power button, a pause that allowed the mind to detach from the pace of the day and prepare for something slower and more contained. The sound that followed was measured and gentle, not designed to excite the nervous system, but to signal that a transition was taking place in a controlled and predictable way. Placing a disc into the console became a repeated ritual that quietly structured many evenings, because it required patience and attention without urgency, something increasingly rare in daily life. This short period of waiting allowed thoughts to slow down, breathing to soften, and attention to gather instead of remaining scattered across many concerns. In a world filled with constant movement and expectation, the PlayStation created a small pocket of stillness where nothing was demanded beyond presence. Each time people returned to the console, it greeted them exactly as they had left it, preserving progress without judgment or pressure, which created a deep sense of continuity. This consistency mattered to the brain because familiarity reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is one of the main sources of mental fatigue. Over time, evenings naturally began to organize themselves around this presence. As tasks were completed, conversations faded, and the room gradually settled into a quieter state. The PlayStation did not interrupt this process or attempt to accelerate it, but waited silently, offering the same calm experience regardless of how much time had passed. This reliability built trust because it felt like a space outside of urgency, where time could pause without consequence and attention could rest. Without drawing attention to itself, the quiet gray box became associated not only with play, but with comfort, stability, and the feeling of returning to something familiar after a long day. When the PlayStation 2 arrived in homes around the world, gaming quietly stopped feeling like an activity that needed to be planned and slowly became something that naturally fit into the rhythm of everyday life. Released in the year 2000, the PlayStation 2 entered a world that was already changing, as evenings were becoming more indoor-focused and technology was beginning to feel less foreign and more familiar within personal spaces. Unlike earlier consoles, the PlayStation 2 did not arrive as a sudden interruption, but as a continuation of something people were already comfortable with, allowing it to settle gently into living rooms without demanding attention. Over time, the presence of the console began to feel permanent, as if it belonged to the room in the same way furniture or lighting did. Always available, always waiting, and never in a hurry. Historically, this moment marked an important shift because the PlayStation 2 would go on to become one of the most widely adopted pieces of consumer technology ever created, eventually reaching more than 150 million units sold worldwide. What made this significant was not just how many people owned the console, but how often it was used and how naturally it blended into daily routines. People no longer felt the need to justify turning it on, because playing games no longer required excitement or preparation, but instead became something done almost automatically at the end of the day. Evenings slowly developed a familiar structure. As responsibilities faded, rooms grew quieter, and attention naturally moved toward the screen without urgency or expectation. Games during the PlayStation 2 era felt expansive, not because they were louder or more intense, but because they allowed players to remain inside their worlds for long periods of time without pressure. Saving progress became an expected part of the experience, reinforcing the idea that nothing would be lost by stepping away and returning later, which aligned closely with how the human brain prefers to relax. This sense of continuity reduced mental effort, allowing attention to settle gently rather than remain alert or defensive. Another historical detail that shaped this era was the PlayStation 2's role as a DVD player, which placed it at the center of evening life, even when no games were being played. For many households, the console became the device used to watch movies, listen to quiet background sound, or simply fill the room with a soft glow, further strengthening its association with rest rather than stimulation. As nights repeated themselves, the brain began to recognize the presence of the PlayStation 2 as a signal that the day was ending and that a calmer state could begin. This association mattered because the brain learns comfort through repetition, and repetition turns actions into habits without conscious effort. Over months and years, gaming during this period stopped feeling like something new or demanding, and instead became something familiar and emotionally neutral, a space where expectations were low and control felt gentle. From a historical perspective, this is why the PlayStation 2 era is often remembered not for constant excitement, but for stability, familiarity, and the feeling of returning to something known. The console did not need to push players forward aggressively, because its greatest strength was allowing them to stay, to linger, and to return again without consequence. In this way, the PlayStation 2 quietly transformed gaming from an occasional escape into a dependable part of everyday life, shaping how an entire generation learned to rest while remaining engaged. When the PlayStation 4 arrived, gaming no longer felt like something that needed to evolve dramatically, because by this point, it had already found a comfortable place in everyday life. Released in 2013, the PlayStation 4 entered homes during a period when digital routines were already well established, and people had grown accustomed to living alongside technology rather than adjusting themselves around it. This generation did not try to redefine how people played, but instead focused on making the experience smoother, more familiar, and easier to return to at any moment. Historically, this was an important shift because it marked the moment when gaming fully embraced comfort as a core value rather than novelty. The PlayStation 4 did not ask players to learn new habits, but quietly reinforced the ones they already had, allowing gaming to feel less like an activity and more like a background presence that could be stepped into whenever desired. Turning on the console felt natural, almost automatic, as if it were part of the same sequence of actions repeated every evening, alongside dimming the lights, settling into a familiar seat, and letting the day slowly fade. The interface itself reflected this mindset, offering clarity and simplicity without drawing attention to itself, which helped maintain a sense of calm rather than excitement. Over time, the PlayStation 4 became associated not with specific moments, but with consistency, because it offered the same experience every time it was turned on, regardless of how much time had passed since the last session. This reliability mattered to the brain because predictable environments reduce mental effort and allow attention to rest instead of remaining alert. Historically, the PlayStation 4 era coincided with a period when people were spending more time indoors, often seeking familiar digital spaces where they could relax without needing to engage actively with others. Gaming during this time became less about challenge and more about presence, offering a controlled environment where progress was steady, expectations were low, and time moved gently. The PlayStation 4 also arrived during a time when digital libraries became more common, reducing the need for physical interaction and allowing entire collections of games to exist quietly within the console itself. This shift subtly changed the relationship between players and games, because access became effortless, and effortlessness often leads to routine. Another historical detail that shaped this era was the rise of background connectivity, where online features were present but unobtrusive, allowing players to remain connected without being pulled away from solitude. Notifications existed, but they rarely demanded immediate response, preserving the quiet nature of evening play. The PlayStation 4 did not emphasize speed or spectacle, but stability, ensuring that returning to a game felt safe, familiar, and uninterrupted. Over months and years, this consistency shaped how evenings were experienced, as gaming became one of the most reliable ways to transition from the demands of the day into a calmer state of mind. The console became less noticeable precisely because it worked so well, blending seamlessly into routines rather than standing out as a focal point. From a historical perspective, this era represents the moment when gaming reached emotional maturity, no longer needing to prove itself or justify its place in daily life. The PlayStation 4 did not push boundaries aggressively, but instead deepened existing ones, reinforcing the idea that games could be a steady presence rather than a source of stimulation. In this way, the PlayStation 4 became closely associated with comfort, familiarity, and the gentle repetition of routine, shaping how people learn to unwind without disengaging completely. When the PlayStation 5 arrived, it entered a world that already felt saturated with screens, information, and constant movement, which made its most noticeable quality not speed, but silence. Released in 2020, during a period defined by global uncertainty and a sudden shift towards staying indoors, the PlayStation 5 became part of homes at a time when people were seeking stability more than novelty. Historically, this context mattered deeply because gaming was no longer just entertainment, but one of the few consistent spaces where time could still feel structured and predictable. The PlayStation 5 did not present itself as a dramatic reinvention of gaming, but rather as a refinement of something already familiar, focusing on removing friction rather than adding stimulation. For many players, the most surprising change was not how fast games loaded, but how quickly the transition from intention to experience disappeared. Waiting became shorter, interruptions faded, and the space between deciding to play and actually playing grew almost invisible. This absence of waiting altered the rhythm of evenings in a subtle but important way. Previously, small delays allowed the mind to prepare for transition. But now the console responded almost immediately, creating a smoother and quieter flow between daily life and play. The brain adapted quickly to this new rhythm, finding comfort not in anticipation, but in continuity. Historically, this shift reflected a broader cultural movement towards seamless experiences, where technology aimed to disappear into the background rather than assert its presence. The PlayStation 5 embodied this philosophy by reducing noise, minimizing friction, and allowing players to remain immersed without disruption. At the same time, the physical presence of the console stood out more than before, yet its operation felt quieter, cooler, and more restrained. This contrast created an interesting balance, where the object itself was visible, but its behavior was gentle and unobtrusive. During this period, gaming increasingly became a way to manage time rather than escape it, offering structure during days that otherwise felt unstructured. The PlayStation 5 arrived when many people were redefining their routines, blending work, rest, and leisure into the same physical spaces. In this environment, the console became a stable anchor, offering familiar worlds that could be entered and exited without emotional effort. Historically, the PS5 era also coincided with a growing awareness of mental well-being, which influenced how players approached games, often seeking calm, presence, and immersion rather than challenge or competition. Games began to feel less like tasks to complete and more like spaces to inhabit, aligning with the console's emphasis on smoothness and flow. The silence of the PlayStation 5, both literal and metaphorical, allowed attention to settle without being pulled in multiple directions. Fans noticed that the console rarely demanded attention through noise or interruption, reinforcing the sense that it existed to support routines rather than disrupt them. Over time, this quality reshaped expectations as players began to value experiences that respected their mental space. From a historical perspective, the PlayStation 5 represents a moment when gaming fully embraced minimalism, prioritizing presence over spectacle. It did not ask players to learn new habits, but instead removed obstacles that stood in the way of existing ones. As nights repeated themselves, the console became part of a quieter future, where speed served calm rather than urgency. In this way, the PlayStation 5 pointed toward a direction where gaming would continue to exist not as an escape from life, but as a gentle extension of it. The human brain did not evolve to handle endless uncertainty, constant noise, or environments where outcomes feel unpredictable, which is why games have always held a quiet and lasting appeal. Long before digital screens existed, the brain learned comfort through patterns, repetition, and clear cause and effect relationships, all of which reduced the need for constant vigilance. Games naturally recreate these conditions by offering structured spaces where actions lead to understandable results, allowing the brain to relax without losing focus. From a neurological perspective, this is important because the brain is constantly scanning for safety, and predictable systems signal that nothing unexpected is about to happen. Historically, this explains why games have appeared in nearly every culture, whether through physical play, strategy, storytelling, or ritualized competition, long before modern technology. Digital games simply extended this ancient relationship by providing controlled environments that could be entered and exited at will. One of the key reasons the brain is drawn to games lies in the balance they create between attention and rest, because they require engagement without demanding emotional risk. Unlike real life, games offer consequences without lasting loss, which allows the brain to explore, experiment, and focus without triggering stress responses. This balance becomes especially soothing during periods of fatigue, uncertainty, or emotional overload, when the brain seeks spaces that feel manageable. Games also provide clear feedback, gently reinforcing the brain's natural reward systems without overwhelming them. Small achievements, steady progress, and visible improvement activate dopamine pathways in a measured way, creating satisfaction rather than urgency. Historically, this pattern became more pronounced as games evolved from short challenges into persistent worlds, allowing the brain to associate them with continuity rather than novelty. The ability to return to a familiar environment and continue where one left off mirrors how memory and identity function, reinforcing a sense of coherence. From a cognitive standpoint, the brain prefers environments where effort leads to recognizable outcomes, and games are designed precisely around this principle. They teach the brain that time spent inside them is meaningful, even when nothing tangible is produced. Another reason games feel comforting lies in the sense of control they offer, which contrasts sharply with many aspects of modern life. The brain responds positively to situations where input and output are clearly linked, because this reduces anxiety and cognitive load. Historically, as daily life became more complex and abstract, games increasingly served as spaces where control could be gently reclaimed. This does not mean games replace reality, but that they offer temporary alignment between intention and outcome. Games also engage imagination in a way that does not require emotional vulnerability, allowing the brain to remain active without feeling exposed. This makes them uniquely suited to quiet evenings, when mental energy is limited, but the desire for engagement remains. Over time, the brain learns to associate games with safety, familiarity, and emotional neutrality, especially when played in consistent environments. Repeated exposure strengthens this association, turning gaming into a reliable signal that the mind can slow down. From a historical perspective, this explains why gaming has become a common end-of-day activity across cultures, ages, and lifestyles. The brain recognizes games as spaces where effort is contained, outcomes are fair, and time feels cooperative rather than demanding. In this way, games are not merely entertainment, but tools the brain uses to regulate itself, offering balance between stimulation and rest. As digital environments continue to evolve, this relationship remains rooted in ancient neural preferences, proving that the appeal of games is not new, but deeply human. As the night slowly deepens and the quiet of the room becomes more noticeable, the presence of games begins to soften, gently fading into the background where it belongs. For decades, games have followed people through their evenings, adapting to changing rooms, changing technologies, and changing lives, while quietly maintaining the same purpose they have always served. They have offered spaces where attention could settle, where effort felt contained, and where time could move without resistance. Historically, this role has remained remarkably consistent, even as screens grew brighter and worlds became larger, because the brain's need for calm structure never truly changed. As consoles evolved from simple machines into familiar companions, they became part of nightly rhythms, appearing not as interruptions, but as markers that the day was slowly coming to an end. Over time, the brain learned to associate these moments with safety and closure, recognizing that nothing more was required and that the remaining hours could unfold without urgency. In the quiet after play, when controllers rest and screens dim, the mind often lingers for a moment, gently replaying fragments of familiar worlds, sounds, and movements. These memories do not demand attention, but drift softly, like thoughts that know they do not need to be finished. This gentle drifting is important because the brain prepares for sleep not by stopping suddenly, but by gradually letting go of focus. Historically, humans have always relied on transitions to guide the mind into rest, whether through stories, rituals, or repetitive sounds that signaled the end of activity. In modern life, games have quietly joined this tradition, becoming one of the many ways the brain learns that it is safe to slow down. The familiarity of returning to the same spaces night after night creates a sense of emotional neutrality, where nothing unexpected needs to be processed. This neutrality allows the nervous system to release tension, shifting attention inward rather than outward. As the room grows still, the absence of movement becomes noticeable, and the body begins to follow the mind, breathing more slowly and deeply. Thoughts lose their sharp edges, no longer pushing forward, but gently circling before settling. There is no need to complete anything, no need to progress, and no need to remember details, because the day has already provided enough structure. Sleep does not arrive as an event, but as a continuation of the calm that has already been established. The quiet left behind after games mirrors the quiet that comes before sleep, making the transition feel natural rather than abrupt. Historically, this is why familiar activities at the end of the day are so powerful, because they create a bridge between wakefulness and rest. As screens darken and rooms return to stillness, the brain recognizes that it can finally release control, trusting that nothing important will be missed. The mind no longer needs to hold on to plans, outcomes, or expectations, because the night exists solely for rest. In this space, attention becomes lighter, drifting without effort, guided more by sensation than thought. The steady rhythm of breathing replaces the rhythm of play, and the body begins to sink into its surroundings. Sleep comes not as a sudden change, but as a gentle arrival, shaped by repetition, familiarity, and the quiet comfort of routine. And as the night continues, the worlds that once filled the screen fade completely, leaving only rest, silence, and the slow passage of time.